Hello, welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan, and today we are going to be talking about very important subject of Russian foreign policy. Which direction is Russia headed in its relations with the West, with India and the wider Asian region? What are some of the challenges that Moscow is likely to confront over the next few years? And joining me to discuss these questions is Dmitri Trenin, director of the Moscow Carnegie Centre and a leading expert on Russian foreign policy, and a former army officer, somebody with long experience in the, shall I say, strategic and security sphere on the Russian side. Welcome to the show, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Glad to be on the show.
Let's start, Dmitry, with the recent decision of the Russian Federation to withdraw from Syria. The withdrawal decision, the decision to send forces there in the first place last year have been the subject of animated conversation around the world. This was seen as a big power play by President Putin, the rise of a new interventionist or more assertive Russia. Tell us, what was it that drove President Putin to want to intervene in Syria in the first place in the way that he did? And why has he disengaged within a relatively short period of time?
Well, I think that the decision to go in was basically dictated by the analysis of Mr. Putin that unless Russia intervened, Bashar al-Assad would be toppled. And in short order, Damascus would be taken over by ISIS, giving a huge propaganda victory to Islamist extremists. This is something that he was absolutely determined to forestall, and he had the instrument to do that. Now, having gone into Syria, Mr. Putin's strategy was to pummel the opposition strongly enough to bring it to the negotiating table with the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad and have the United States join Russia in leading the peace process in Syria, which was basically going in the direction of Mr. Putin's principal foreign policy goal, not just in Syria or the Middle East, but more broadly. And the goal was and is and will remain for Russia to be recognized, first of all, by the United States as a global power, as a great power, co-equal in various international situations with the United States. So that was the reason for going in. And I should add that the people who were fighting Bashar al-Assad, many of them, in particular the people in the ISIS camp, were former residents or even citizens now of the Russian Federation. So Mr. Putin was resolved to make sure that those people never got back.
So these are essentially Chechens or people from
Well, they come from an assortment
parts?
of ethnic groups across Russia, and actually quite a few of them are ethnic Russians. So that was Putin said very clearly, if a clash is inevitable, and he thinks that a clash with Islamist extremists is inevitable. So if it's inevitable, you go and hit first. And that's what he did in Syria.
Right. In terms of the timing, you mentioned that the Russian side was quite convinced that if they didn't go in when they did, the Assad regime was imperiled, was likely to collapse. But if you look at the years that have followed since the start of the civil war in Syria, there have been times when Bashar al-Assad actually looked far more vulnerable than last year. So to what extent was the decision driven by this larger geopolitical consideration that you allude to when you say Moscow wants America to take Russia seriously as a world power? How important was that as a factor as opposed to the immediate vulnerability of Assad? Because, Bashar al-Assad looked far more, say 4 years ago there was talk of his imminent collapse. The regime seemed to have restored some of its authority even before the Russians came, although Russia's intervention has changed things decisively.
Well, I think that the Russian involvement in Syria has gone through several stages.
Okay.
I think the most important thing for the Russians was to make sure that the issues of military intervention, regime change, and such like issues not be decided by one power alone, i.e. by the United States. I think that the Russian policy on Syria was very much informed by what happened in Libya in 2011 and later. And the motto that Mr. Putin was operating under was never again. Assad could have been toppled earlier, but then his opponents were largely opposition groups, many of them supported by the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar.
But also linked to Al-Qaeda and
Some
very
of them were
unsavory...
yes, they were, absolutely. But the ISIS factor only materialized in its full-blown form in 2014. And that basically made it so much bigger an issue than before. And also Russia's involvement in Syria needs to be addressed against the backdrop of what was happening between the United States and Russia, what was happening in Ukraine. And I would submit to you that in 2014, Russia essentially broke out of the post-Cold War order designed and upheld by the United States and pushed back against the United States. That was a qualitative change in Russian foreign policy.
And once it did that, then it said, well, why confine the breakout to the Ukrainian front alone, but let's address other issues that are equally important for Russia.
In Ukraine, from Putin's perspective, Russia was defending its turf, if you like, its vital national security interests, preventing Ukraine from ever becoming a member of NATO, that kind of stuff. So that was defensive. In Syria, that was offensive. Russia inserted itself into the middle of a civil war in Syria and basically broke the monopoly of the United States on the use of force globally. And that was a wholly different challenge. But I agree with you, those were two parts of the same new policy.
When you said that Russia, after Libya, had this never again view, that we can't allow this situation to repeat, was it that there should not be regime change again, or the messy form that regime change took in Libya, where a regime such as that of Gaddafi, whatever one may think of it, vanished, but has not been replaced by any semblance of what you could call stable order? So was it the chaos that would follow that Russia was essentially objecting to, or the principle of outside intervention being used to topple a government?
Well, I think we need to remember that the Libya intervention occurred under the resolution, initially under the resolution passed by the UN Security Council, where Russia
chose not to veto,
abstained. And Russia essentially paved the way for NATO to intervene militarily and then abuse the UN Security Council resolution and go for regime change, not stopping at protecting civilians, but rather going all the way to oust or help Libyan rebels oust Muammar
Although one could
Gaddafi.
argue it was pretty clear when, I think 1973, was it 1973, the resolution, when the original resolution was passed, it was quite clear to many observers that this is the direction in which the French and the British and eventually the Americans are going to go.
I agree. And yet, if you look at the text of the resolution, it did not permit, and I think NATO countries themselves admitted that, they went beyond what had been. So basically, never again was directed at Russia's own policy. Russia will no longer appease the West. Russia will stand up to its own and defend its own interests, its own view of how things should be, to the extent that Russia was capable of doing that. I think we need to realize that Russian resources are limited. Mr. Putin is punching way above his weight, and he is fully aware of that. And that's why, having performed pretty effectively in Syria, he decided that Russia should scale down its direct military involvement.
Well, I suppose if the goal was to, as you say, soften up the opposition, deliver lethal blows on ISIS and push the situation towards a dialogue, clearly by those metrics, the Russian intervention has been effective.
So far, yes.
But this was a risky step for him to take.
It was, but it was a calculated step. It was calculated risk, I should say. Mr. Putin, in my view, is a fairly cautious person. But when he decides to go for something that's risky, he is not risk shy. So he will take risks when he thinks that the risk is worth taking. That happened in Chechnya when he was virtually alone back in 1999 among Russian politicians in going for victory in Chechnya, basically. And similarly in this case. So he decided that the risks were worth taking. At the same time, he realized that you can only sustain this at a certain level and for a certain period of time. And he was always saying that. He was saying many times that the intervention will not be indefinite in terms of the time limits, and that it will be limited in terms of primarily air power being used. No ground troops, no combat forces.
Right. But with advisors.
Advisors are a different story.
Right.
Yes, advisors were there.
Right. No, in many ways, it's a textbook example of a different type of intervention compared to the open-ended ones that we've seen the United States engage in over the last 2 decades. But I wanted to ask you, the initial Russian reluctance to accept the fact that the downing of a Russian plane from the Sinai could have been an act of terror that flowed in some way from its intervention in Syria targeting ISIS, suggested that Putin and his advisors were aware of the domestic concerns that his intervention might have generated back at home.
Oh, absolutely. I think that they were fully aware of that. And the worst thing that could have happened was a terrorist attack inside Russia, exposing the flaws in the Russian security system. What happened was terrible, and yet it happened outside of Russia. And Russian officials were not directly responsible for security at Sharm el-Sheikh.
Right.
So tragic as it was, terrible as it was, and clearly connected as it was with the intervention in Syria, that was something that the Russian people and President Putin were able to weather.
If the Russian press was more, shall we say, independent or more critical of the government, might the Sharm el-Sheikh bombing have led to what in the West they call a wobble? The public opinion wavering and saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be intervening in Syria?
Well, I would say this. In today's information age, unlike, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago, it's virtually impossible to stop various analyses, suspicions, versions of events, etc., to penetrate wherever. So I think that a lot of people in Russia were thinking from day one that that might have been a terrorist attack, that might have been connected to the Syrian involvement. Although the official media were talking about something else rather than a terrorist attack, a lot of people at the back of their minds were thinking along those lines. But in today's psychological climate in Russia, patriotism, nationalism, these things count for far less than they used to.
The downing of a Russian fighter plane by the Turks was also, in a way, a critical moment in the Russian intervention. I think the whole world waited with bated breath as to how is Moscow, how is Putin going to react to this. But the Russian reaction was very restrained. There was no military escalation. no great diplomatic, shall we say, retaliation against the Turks. Has that chapter now closed, or do you think the long-term impress of the shooting of a Russian plane by the Turks will manifest itself in some way?
Well, first of all, I would slightly disagree. I think that the Russian reaction or Russian response to Turkey directly was limited, was constrained. And I think it was very clearly guided by the knowledge of the existence of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Had the Russians decided to annihilate the airfield from which the Turkish planes had taken off, then Article 5 would be evoked. But the Russians essentially annihilated the pro-Turkish group that shot the pilot from the ground. So the area where the plane was downed, populated by the Turkomans, many of whom were military allies of Turkey inside Syria, that area was wiped out. So there was military response, but it was not against Turkey.
Right.
Now, there was a period, maybe 7 weeks ago, when, or slightly more, let's say, beginning of February, 2 months ago, when Turkey was almost openly talking about the option of a military invasion of Syria. And that, I think, was the most dangerous moment since the downing of the plane. That might have led to a collision between the Turkish forces and the Syrian forces and the Russian forces inside Syria. Might have led to a, as I said, to a fight between the Russians and the Turks inside Syria. And then, the question would have been, does that qualify as Article 5 case or not? It's outside, but it's...
Right.
We're behind that. We moved on. But the situation between Russia and Turkey remains tense. And the relationship will not be repaired, in my view, for as long as President Erdogan leads Turkey. And now that there is a flare-up of violence in the conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh in the South Caucasus, quite a few people in Russia are looking at the potential Turkish connection, Turkish role, and things are getting back to where they once were between Russia and Turkey.
Right.
It's a very deplorable situation.
Right. We are now in a American presidential election cycle or season. The last time this happened, and we had Obama elected and Hillary Clinton as his Secretary of State, she used this phrase, reset. And in some ways, US-Russia relations are as much in need of a reset as they were back then, perhaps even more so, because you've had the Ukrainian crisis, you've had the standoff or differences of opinion over Syria. From the Russian perspective, what is it that you feel, or what is it that the Russian leadership feels Washington must do to bring Moscow-Washington relations back on an even keel?
Well, first of all, I would say that I don't think that the Kremlin believes they have a dog in that fight. Putin has said a few things about Donald Trump. Donald Trump has said a few things about Putin.
Right.
But even if Donald Trump becomes, which is unlikely in my view, President of the United States, it is not at all clear that the relationship will be on the mending path.
But with the Hillary Clinton presidency?
Well, I think Hillary Clinton is someone who is
she was the author of the original reset?
Well, she is not. She was the person who was authorized by President Obama to press the button. And then, if you remember, the actual caption was not in Russian. The reset was translated as overcharge. So I think in that sense, it was prophetic.
Yes.
Hillary Clinton has little time for Russia, but she is someone who is pretty well known in Russia, not much liked. but someone who is seen as a fairly conventional politician who would do the things that are more or less predictable. It would be very different from if Donald Trump were president, but that's, as I said, that's still regarded by a lot of people, most people, as unlikely. I think that it's clear what the Russians want the United States to do. And basically this is go ahead and fix the Ukraine issue on the basis of Ukraine's strict neutrality. Do the stuff in Syria on an equal basis and recognize Russia as a great power globally and lift the sanctions, more or less. But this is precisely what...
And accept the status of Crimea as integral part of Russia now? Is there any wiggle room on Crimea?
I don't think that the Russians expect the status of Crimea to be recognized by the United States anytime soon. Frankly, they don't even believe that the sanctions will be lifted in the next few decades. So the Russian view of what the United States might do in its relations with, or its policy toward Russia is very bleak. They expect bad things. They do not exactly expect good things. But in my view, the United States is absolutely unwilling to go down that path. The United States doesn't have much time for Russia and will not have more time for Russia under the new president. I think that for the United States, Russia will be an irritant, a major irritant. An irritant, however, that does not deserve to be treated as a serious player. And that is something that, unfortunately, will continue to poison the relationship.
Is there a perception in Moscow that India, which has enjoyed excellent relations with Russia, Russian Federation and the Soviet Union for the past 6-7 decades, is there a perception that India increasingly has less time for Russia and is more concerned with building its relationship with the United States?
Well, I think that in today's world you cannot preserve exclusive relationships. The Indo-Soviet relationship was a feature of the Cold War, and both countries were constrained in various ways. They had, in those days, a strong relationship, but again, in a very charged climate of the Cold War. I think that the Russians would prefer India to be still more focused on Russia, particularly in the fields where the Russians felt dominant, such as arms sales, etc. But that's not going to be the case today. India is opening up. India is looking for partners that might help it with its development strategy. And unfortunately, Russia does not have much to offer at this point. So India will be diversifying, which is fine. But it's equally fine for Russia to be, looking for various opportunities around the world, including in India's neighborhood. Still, I would think that both countries...
There's been a deepening of relations with Pakistan, for example.
For example.
Yeah.
But again, the deepening of relations with Pakistan, in my view, does nothing to undermine the very strong relationship that Russia has with India. Russia will be working with Pakistan and doing things and selling a few things that India may have questions about to Pakistan. But I don't think that this will be of the kind or of the scale that would undermine the relationship with India. India is seen in Russia as a strategic partner. And there are 3 countries in Asia that qualify, China and Vietnam being the other 2. And India is, in terms of, let's say, the emerging Asian strategy of Russia, is becoming an ever more important player. Right. Now that China is moving west across Eurasia to meet with Europe, India is becoming even more important as a partner for Russia.
Right. We're almost out of time, but I did want to ask you what you thought of the Western view that Russia's deepening relationship with China is the product of the fact that your relations with the West have soured. So to what extent is the growing relationship between Russia and China the product of tactical shifts in Russian foreign policy, and to what extent is it a deep strategic calculation that Moscow is making?
Well, I think to some extent this is tactical, no question about that, especially at the rhetorical level, especially in 2014 when the rupture occurred. But at a deeper level, I would say that Russia needs to rebalance its foreign policy. For centuries, it has been squarely focused on the West, Europe, and then the United States of America. I think in today's world, Russia needs to look at Asia even more than it looks at Europe today. A lot of action is in Asia, a lot of opportunities are in Asia, and some challenges and even dangers are also in Asia.
On that note, Dmitri Trenin, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on Rajya Sabha TV.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Indian Standard Time. Do join me again next week with another guest. Thank you for watching.